Yeah, yes.
Welcome back, everybody, to day 6 of Foundations of Programming. This is our second week. I'm glad to see those of you who have made it here so far. Kenny, thank you for joining us today. We missed you Friday. Glad to see you here. Tim should be joining us today. We might have some absences this week from some of you guys. 'Cause I understand you guys have VA stuff or out process, so that's okay. I got some DMs. I understand. But now we're going to go ahead and continue where we left off. So last week, we saw the introduction of JavaScript into HTML and CSS. We took some time, a good amount of time, working on Bad Calculator and really understanding how to use JavaScript to add the functionality to our application. So then we're going to build off from that. We're not done with JavaScript yet. There's two more lessons that are going to go into that, and that's going to be APIs and product applications. I give you guys a sneak peek on what to expect on APIs. So let's jump straight into it and talk about them. All right. So what are APIs, right? In short, APIs are simple interfaces for complex actions. And the analogy we're going to use is going to be this restaurant menu. All right. So I showed you guys, I believe the example was the Pokemon API. And API stands for Application Programming Interfaces. Um, the best way of explaining it would be imagine you have a database of a bunch of data, right? Specifically, the Pokemon API that I showed you guys in the demonstration. There's this database that holds large amounts of data of all the different types of Pokemon. I'm going to go ahead and jump to an assumption here. I can assume that most of you guys have heard of Pokemon before. Every now and then I get one or two that I've never heard of Pokemon. Um, and that's okay. Um, but this database holds all the information of every single Pokemon since the first gen to the latest. And I showed you guys as well the type of data that this database retrieves for you. Well, an API is kind of like the face of handling this database, right? It's the interface that allows you to connect to this database and retrieve information, right? Um, it lets one thing communicate with another thing. Essentially, it's going to allow our program, right, our application that we create, interact with some database somewhere, right? There's a lot of APIs out there if you do some research and whatnot that do many things for you, right? We saw the Pokemon API was a very common one. Another one that you can experiment with is stuff like the Rick and Morty API, very similar to the Pokemon. It'll retrieve to you information about Rick and Morty. These are the ones that we used during our lectures to kind of show people how APIs work. But there's some more interesting ones out there, like a weather API that can allow you to get the weather for a specific location of your user, or if you're trying to make a specific application that shows the weather for different locations, you can use the Pokemon the weather API. I used a Spotify API. So Spotify has their own API for developers. If they want to create an application, they can use the Spotify API to take advantage of the music that Spotify has. I use that for one of my personal projects. I've seen fitness APIs. I think Fitness Pal has one, right? Where they have like a database of all these different workouts and stuff, and you can access the API to kind of add some more stuff to your own application. You'll see some other APIs a little bit more smaller. There's APIs for uh, getting geolocation. So whenever you go to a website and it asks you to share your location, there's specific APIs that can help you do that to request the location of your user to show things in their area. The Google Maps, there's an API for that where you can use Google Maps on your application as well. There's a large variety of different APIs that we can use as developers, right? And when it comes to an API, you want to think of it as a restaurant, right? Um, the restaurant menu, to be very specific, that's going to be our analogy here, which is the interface. So when you go to a restaurant, let's say Texas Roadhouse, as an example, and you sit down, right, you're going to get a menu. And the menu here is that website, like the Pokemon API website I showed you. It's going to show you what's available for you, right? And then you can choose what you want to get. right? I want a steak, medium rare, with some mashed potatoes, and some shrimp, right? You're gonna give this to your server, and the server's gonna send it to the back, right, of the restaurant to wherever the chefs are, and it's gonna put in this order for you, right? And if the restaurant, which is the API, has the ingredients for your specific dish, they're going to make this dish and they're going to give it back to you, right? And that's kind of the process of how the API works. We're going to put in some kind of request, or in this analogy, we put in an order, right, to this API or the restaurant. We send our request, they get us our stuff and give it back to us, right? So let us communicate with the kitchen to let them know what we want to eat. Right? Does everyone understand so far what an API kind of is? Do you have any questions before I move forward? Okay. Now, how do we use APIs, right? So the very simple way of doing it is using a URL, right? And there's different things that are going to allow you to kind of format this URL to talk to the API, but we essentially use a specific URL that points to the API, some kind of backend point. And then within this request, we send this URL and then some other data like, whether we want, 5 Pokemon, whether they want to be random, whether we want them to be a very specific type. And we send this all in a request, and it takes this request to figure out where in the database it's going to give the information. It's going to return it to us back in a JSON format, right? JSON standing for JavaScript Object Notation. And the reason why it's JSON is because JSON is one of those objects that are very easy to kind of convert over to different other languages. So it's really easy for applications that are like built in Python to be able to receive JSON objects, um, and then convert it to something readable in Python. So it's a type of data type that's very easy to convert into other data types, right? Here we see a little diagram. Here we have like your end consumers, or I guess your client, right? Whether it's going to be like a desktop application, some kind of messaging application, whether it's your phone, whether it's some kind of store online. Uh, these applications here put in a request to the API interface, which is that website. That interface takes that request and sends it to its backend, right, wherever this database is at, and it's going to query the database for the information you're looking for. Do I have any questions so far? Here we see think an object with key and value pairs. So that's essentially what JSON really is. It's an object, right, that holds key value pairs. And I'm going to show you an example in a little bit. So before we continue moving forward with the actual code, let's look at, once again, the Poke API a little bit more in depth. So here's the Poke API. This is, I guess, what you would call a version of the interface itself. And it tells you how it's supposed to work. It has a little try it out section where it already has a pre-formatted URL, right? And what this is telling you is this is exactly what it expects, right? What the API, the backend of this API is expecting to receive, right, to get information. It expects a URL in this manner that's going to point to the pokeapi.co, and then it's going to take the this URL pattern here of API version 2. And then after that is going to take some specific parameters here. As we see here, it's going to be the Pokemon / Ditto. And when we submit this, this is what is expected to be returned to us. And this essentially is a JSON object, just formatted in a way that looks better. We can see the raw version of it by clicking here. And this is the JSON right here. Right, as you can see, it's in curly braces, right? And it looks a little confusing here because it's very nested, but it's key value pairs, right? Just like JavaScript objects, right? The first key is abilities, and the value is a list here, a list of different abilities, right? It has two abilities from what it looks like. Ditto has the ability of Limber, and it has the ability of Imposter. Notice that this list is a list of more objects, right? With key value pairs, the ability itself, and then the value is another object here of key value pairs with the name of the ability, and then a URL. We have a couple of other key value pairs here that aren't really too important, but this is how a JSON is structured, right? And I say a JSON because the object is in the word. It's kind of like saying like cat card, right? You're calling access card, so it's a little redundant. But this is the JSON, the JavaScript object, and as you see, once again, it's structured in key value pairs, formatting the information that you get. And when working with APIs, it's always important to look at the documentation because every API is structured very differently. Some are a lot more simpler than others. Some are a little bit more complex and are going to require a lot more authentication than some. We use the Poke API very specifically because it's a very, very simple API to work with without adding all the extra complexities of trying to authenticate through the API. And what I mean by that is that when we make a request to the Poke API, all it's expecting is this URL, right? And I hope I don't confuse you guys, but I can show you a more complex API. And the Spotify API is one of those examples here. The Spotify API has a very complex method of working where it expects tokens, expiration times, it expects multiple different headers. Just authorizing through it tells you the different types of things it's going to require in the request. And this is very out of scope, but this just kind of give you an example of the difference between the Poke API and something that's a lot more complex, right? Here, it expects us to generate some kind of random string, almost like a code for us to authenticate through. It expects a lot of different things, and it gives us different examples of how to do it as well, right? This requires a client ID, the type of response, a redirect URI, the state, scope, and you guys probably are, don't know what half of these mean, and that's okay. I just wanted to show you the difference between something like the Poke API and the Spotify API. There's different versions of APIs out there, some more complex than others. And the only way to know how to ping this API or essentially talk to it is to go through the documentation. And that's a skill that you're going to learn through time as you are with Platoon and you are doing more, research and working on your own or with a group. This is kind of a skill that you learn with time. We will teach you some very simple ways of doing this, but there's obviously, as I said, every API is different. Every API is a little bit more complex than others. You'll see common trends between these APIs of what they expect, and you'll start seeing that they'll require like params, and then these params will have specific different types of key value pairs. And as you work with different APIs, you'll kind of start learning how what some of these things are. But these will come with time, and they'll come later in the course. Right now, we're going to stick with the Poke API to keep it very simple to show you how APIs essentially work. Do you have any questions on the Poke API or the other type of APIs out there, or how we came to the conclusion of how to talk to this Poke API? And I'll show you guys right now an example of how it works in code. But in short, it uses a URL path, right? And this URL path is what we call an endpoint.
So when you call the API, that was using the fetch command, right?
Yes, we're going to be using the fetch command or something very similar to that. There's different ways of doing it, but you're on the right ballpark. That's what we're going to get to in a little bit. But yes, we use a very specific command that's going to tell our code, hey, I'm talking to an API here, and I'm sending a request, right? And the fetch command is the syntax used for that. And we're going to elaborate a little bit more on that. But yes, you're correct. All right. Well, let's go back to the slides and let's check let's check out some demo code. And you see here that this is the old way of doing things. And you might be wondering yourself, Roger, why are you teaching the old way if it's old and not how it's done these days? Well, because there's different APIs out there, some more outdated than others. But on top of that, when you go to when you get a job, right, you're going to see all types of code, right? You're going to see what we call legacy code. Some companies have very outdated code, and sometimes the documentation isn't the best, right? So we ensure that we show you guys the old way and new way of doing things. So not only do you know both of them, but you're in some way exposed to the information. So if you ever get to a job and they're working with very outdated code, it's not something that's new to you. Uh, Something that's very common, or a type of field that's very common to have very old code or use outdated platforms or frameworks and whatnot, are government jobs, right? So these contracting jobs, you work with a federal job, they tend to use very outdated stacks. Their code is very outdated. Uh, they have very outdated versions, and sometimes if you stick too long working on in the federal side, when you try to move over to the like commercial side, it can be kind of a learning curve, right? Because you're only used to very outdated means, but then you try to switch over to a little bit something more modern, like let's say you got some kind of job at Google, their code is going to be a lot more updated than what you were used to. So there might be a learning curve there, especially if you did all your learning and you had all your experience of working with older versions of stuff. So it's always good to see both ends so you understand what it is, how it works, and you're not kind of blindsided when you ever encounter something like this. But nonetheless, we're going to talk about this. And as Chase mentioned, we're going to use the fetch command. And the fetch command is a built-in method that comes with your JavaScript. And it knows what fetch is. So when you start typing fetching, the first argument that you're going to pass in within your fetch method is going to be the URL of the API that you're trying to ping, right? Now, Roger, where did you get this URL? Once again, this is coming from the documentation. So this URL is going to look very different compared to whatever, like, depends on the API you're trying to talk to. But for this specific API here that we have an example, this is the URL that we got from the documentation, right? If we were trying to ping the Poke API, I would grab this URL here. I could just do copy a clipboard. And this URL is what I would add within the fetch method, right? So you don't have to guess what path it is. The documentation will tell you the endpoints that they have available for you as a developer to ping, right? So once again, this fetch method here is going to take the URL of whatever API you're trying to talk to, and then we use the .then method, right? And what the .then method is trying to, or is doing, is essentially it runs the first line here, and this sends a request to this API at this endpoint. What a .then is saying is that once this API call has been made and it's complete, the .then method is saying, now I want to do the following, right? If that makes sense in a way, right? So the .then saying, hey, once this comes back, do line 2, right? And the .then method, it takes a response, right? Because if you recall to the one of the first classes that we talked about when working with request and response, you send a request and you get a response back, right? And the response is typically in a JSON format. If it's not, you want to convert it into a JSON format, and that's what they're essentially doing here. They're taking this response, they're using this arrow function here to let it know that, hey, I'm converting this regular response to a response.json, right? So they use the .json method that comes with JavaScript to convert it into a JSON object, right? So this line right here is grabbing the response that's coming from the API, and it's essentially going through the code and formatting it and converting it into a JavaScript object. Then we have another .then method. This .then method, what it's saying is once this line 2 is complete, afterwards, what it should be It should just be raw data. And once I get the raw data, what I'm going to do is I'm going to console log the data. And then the dot catch method here is specifically catching an error. So in the event something went wrong in these 3 lines of code and it sends an error back to us, we want to catch this error and I want to console log the error, right? So once again, the first part of the code is putting a request to this API. Line 2 is going to convert it into JSON. And then line 3 is going to take that raw data that we got after converting it to JSON, and we're going to console.log it so we can visualize the data. But in the event any of these lines fail from line 1 to line 3, and it sends us an error, I want to do the dot catch section and console.log the error so I can see what error I got. Does this make sense so far? Is this kind of like a
I'm sorry. So the data is essentially the JSON response in this third line.
correct, right? This line 2 right here is going to convert the response into JSON data, right?
Okay.
Once this comes back, we use the .then method again, and that's what data is. Data is the response.json.
Are the maybe perhaps dumb question, but are the res and the data keywords, or it could be anything?
Correct. It could be anything. They
Okay.
use REST as like an acronym. You give it whatever uh, name you want to call it to make it mean something to you. But this, they could have typed out response, they could have typed out X, whatever they want to type out, that would end up taking the place of whatever response is coming back from this API. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it knows by the second step, after getting their JSON response to that the third line will be essentially logging the data to the console.
Yeah. So this is doing something very similar to this. Let's go ahead and do this. If I had, let's say mm, name equals Jason. Uh, this is saying something. It's doing something very similar to this, where it's grabbing what's coming back and it's doing something to upper things to upper,
You
or
could just say name to uppercase or something. Yeah.
name dot
Okay.
to upper, or I think is it uppercase?
It's two uppercase, I
I
think.
haven't used
Parentheses.
this. Yeah, it's something
Yeah.
like this, right? There you go.
Yeah. I mean the
So
C being capital. Hmm.
let name isn't deprecated.
So maybe it's trying to grab a key name or
Do they
something.
want cons? I'm confused with why it's saying it's deprecated. It's okay. That's not the big issue,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
What they're doing is, in short, they're adding a method to the end of it, right? So this could have been
Mhm.
written like this: fetch some URL.com .then, right? So whatever comes back from this function here, because in short, right under the hood, this is really a function, right? The fetch is a function. It's a function that's taking the URL and talking to an API, and this is going to return something, right? Well, after we do that, we're going to say .then response res.json,
Mhm.
and what's coming back from this, we're going to use .then again and say data console log data. Right? Does
Okay.
that make sense? There,
Yeah,
they it looks a little
I
confusing because it's in multiple lines, but it's to make it the formatting a lot easier. But they're essentially doing this, that whatever comes back from this URL from the fetch method, they're using that .then method on that, which is going to do something else. So this will return something else. And then once this is complete, they appended the .then method again, right? So it's kind of saying to uppercase dot to lowercase, right? Something like that. Does that make sense? They're
yeah,
appending multiple methods to the same function, whatever comes back from this function, right?
yeah. I'm good.
Okay. Yeah, it looks a little confusing because of how the .then is structured. All they're doing is just putting it to a different line, right? So it's not a long URL. Cool? this would be the same as doing something like this, to uppercase dot to lowercase, something like that. All right. Okay, let's actually look at this and see how it's working. I want to say it's stock photo. It's supposed to be student practice, but I know it can be a little intimidating to do it at first. So let's actually walk through it together. Here we have our dog photo HTML, and let's open up the JavaScript inside of it. And then we're going to say, okay, open with live server so you can see what it's doing. And it's not complete. This is meant to be an exercise, but I want to show you what it's doing. Right? You don't see it because as you see here, the image is empty. Right? The image, it has an image tag, right? But the source is empty, and so is the alt. If I add a photo of dog here, it should change that here. It shows it's a broken image, right? It just doesn't show anything here because there's no alternate here and there's no source there. But for this, JavaScript is linked to the dog photo API. Well, let's look at it. Let's look at the JavaScript. It's running a fetch method to this URL at an API. And we can visit this API real quickly, dog.co. Right, and it's a very simple API. We can click the dog API, and it gives us an example of how to work the fetch method. And this is what we're using. All right, we got this from the documentation. It expects us to put in a fetch request to this endpoint here. And notice that every time I click it, it gives us a different image, right? The JSON that this fetch method is going to return should look something very similar to this, where the first key value pair is the message itself, and it has a URL to a JPEG file, right? And it's showing it to us here to see what it should look like, right? That's essentially what our JavaScript file is doing, and we can kind of come here and format this code to see how it works. But we're putting this fetch request into this JavaScript file to this API. When it finishes, we're going to use the .then method. This parses through the data and converts it into JSON. And then we get the .then again to grab the data and console.log the data. Or we have an error, right? We catch the error. Well, it's console.logging the data. So I can go ahead and go to my DevTools and look at it. And I see here that it is printing out the data, right? It's able to grab the data, convert it to JSON, and then after it's JSON, we are console.logging it. And you can see here in our console log, here's the object that came back from the moment that we ran this. And if we refresh this, let's look at it. It's a little bit different. This is 6771. We refresh it again. This is something completely different. It's a different image. And why is that? Well, look at the URL path. This URL path for this API is going to grab breeds. From the breeds, it's going to select an image, and then it's going to be at random, right? So this is how this API is structured to be able to grab random images. Kenny says, why can res and data be whatever? It's kind of like using a for loop, Kenny. Right, so whenever you loop through a list, right, you say something like, if you're familiar with Python, we say something like, for I in list of dogs, right? And we're iterating through this list of dogs, and I is a placeholder to represent the item that we are currently on as we loop through. It's very similar to that, right? It's creating some kind of placeholder so we are able to call the item that comes back from that. Does that make sense, Kenny? Awesome. So this JSON file, this JavaScript file, it's working, right? It's successfully pinging this API using this URL, right? This fetch method is pinging the API. And then once it gets a response, let's see if we can console dot then. I don't think it's gonna work. Res console dot log response. Let's see what it gives us. Okay, here we go. So we are able to do it. It didn't do the rest of it, but notice that before we convert it into JSON, when we print out the RES, the response, it's a raw response. This is the raw version of it. It's not formatted into JSON, but this is how the response looks like, right? There's multiple key value pairs, body, headers. We can look at the headers. There's a bunch of stuff that go into it, but this is not readable to us. We can't do anything with this. This tells me nothing, right? That's why we use the .json method to grab this raw response and convert it into something that's readable to us that we can use ourselves, right? Because this here tells me absolutely nothing. I would have to parse through multiple things to see if I can find what I'm looking for. And I don't even know where to begin. I would say maybe right here under response, clone, form data, JSON right here. In the JSON, no, scopes, no. Maybe it's not this one. Text. But you see, it's not readable, right? This is not something that I can use in my code that's going to be useful to me. Which is why once we get this response, we want to convert it into JSON, right? And this method here that comes with JavaScript allows us to do that. It lets us take in a raw response and convert it into a JavaScript object notation that we can use to do something, right? So let's go ahead. Let's remove this console.log response. And once again, once it gets formatted using the .json method, this is what it gives us back, right? The formatted JavaScript object notation that we can use for our code, right? And we're constantly logging this data after it's been converted. And we get a object here with two key value pairs. The first is message, and the second one is the status, letting us know that this request was successful. But we don't really care too much right now about the status. What we really want, we know that it works, but we want this right here. We want this image so we can utilize it on our application. So now that we have this variable right here, data, what can we do to use this URL that we got from this API to make it display on our screen?
You could modify the inner HTML to point to your response.
Yeah, we want to modify our HTML here, specifically the image tag, and add something into the source attribute. So
I was trying to do that independently, but I can't find it in that JSON.
okay, well let's do it here. I'll show you guys an example. So here's line 4, right after it gets the data, right? We already saw it. When we console.log data, it's an object. How do we access objects? How do we access JavaScript objects?
By
Right?
calling the value of whatever key you're looking for.
Yeah, right. We want to call the key and it's going to return us the value, right? That's how we access objects in JavaScript. When we want to access lists, we use index notation. When we want to access an object, we use bracket notation, right? So we call the object, we open up some brackets, we call the key that we're trying to grab, and that's going to return to us the value, right? So I should be able to do something like console.log. I'm going to say data.message, right? Oh, I said brackets. Am I getting confused with Python? No, I mean, it still works. But we'll use bracket notation just so we can stay on the same page. But you can use data bracket message, or you can say data dot message to nest ourselves into this object and grab the response, right? So whichever one you do should work. We can use dot message, or we can use data bracket message, right? Specifically add here the key. And notice here that this is being printed out on line 5, which is the line that I just added. It's printing out the URL. So I'm able to get specifically what I want. So I can get rid of data. I don't need data. I only want the message inside of data. I don't need the other mumbo jumbo. Right now, it's not a big issue, but later on, when you're working with the Poke API, as you saw, we're going to get a huge JSON, right? With all these key value pairs. And sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming. We only want to grab what we need. So we always want to parse through that data and grab the key value pairs that we want ourselves. But as you can see, I can grab the URL that's in the message key. And now I want to add it to this image tag. So how do I grab this image tag?
You have to use the document tag.
Yeah, we're going to want to manipulate our DOM, right? So we're going to use a DOM method. We want to do document dot query selector. There's no specific ID or class here. We can grab an element as well, but let's go ahead and add a class here. And we'll say that this is going to be class dog photo, right? And I'm going to use that class to grab this specific tag. I'm going to say document dot query selector, and I want to grab dog photo. And this one method right here is going to grab this image tag. But now I want to manipulate the source, right? Do you guys know how to grab the source after you've grabbed the tag? Take a guess.
Is it just by using the dot or
you're on the right track, right? So if you recall, when we were messing with the inner text or inner HTML, we were doing dot inner text, right? Or inner HTML. We can do dot source to do the same thing. And then we're going to do an equal sign to assign it something. And I'm going to assign it the data message. And now I get my nice little picture. And if I refresh this page, it's going to, every time I refresh it, it's going to make a new API request to get me a dog. I want you to notice something here. What do you guys see every time I refresh this page? What is happening?
I see in the top left that like the thing keeps popping up, that message.
Yeah, for a split second, it tells me the alternate that I had set, the photo of a dog, and that's telling me that for a split second there is no image. Why do you think that's happening?
Because it takes time to request from the API.
Yes, it takes time, and that's very important to know, right? When you ping APIs, it doesn't just happen automatically. It's putting a request to this API somewhere in somebody's attic, right? On some server, right? Some building somewhere. It's sending this request through the internet with the information that I've given it. In this case, because it's a very simple API, all the information I'm giving it is just a URL. But it's taking this URL, this API, wherever it's located at, it's receiving my request and it's checking it out. Like, okay, some dude, right, in Texas is requesting a photo from me of a random breed, right? Well, let me create this API request. I'm going to grab his request. I'm going to look for this dog photo, and I'm going to send it back to him in the form of a response. And then it's going to send it back to you. All this takes time. Now, it's not too much time. It's like a split second, but there is a lag, right? It does have to go through the process of talking to this API, getting the information, and giving it back to me before my application can use it. And that's something very important to take into account when working with APIs. And I say this because as you guys get deeper into your course and you try to use different APIs, you're going to try to use your application. You're wondering, like, why is my API not working? I'm not getting the information, or I'm getting an error, right? I'm trying to use this key value pair, but it's saying that I'm getting a promise, but I'm not getting a response, right? And what that means is a promise is an incomplete request, right? It's kind of like in the name. It's promising you some information, but it has yet to deliver the information to you. So if you ever get some kind of error where it's saying like uncaught promise, what it's trying to say is that you're trying to display some information or use information that you do not have because we have yet to receive the information from the API, right? So it's not a big issue right now, but it's something to take into account that can happen whenever you guys are working with APIs, which is why we use the method of .then, right? What that .then method is saying in your code is, I'm not going to display anything yet until I get my information back from my request, right? That's why we use the .then method. It is telling our code, hey, you have to wait, right? Wait until this API fetch request is done. And once it's complete, then I want to convert it to JSON. And then once I convert it to JSON, then I want to access the information. Does this make sense so far? All right. Now, quick 10-minute exercise. I want you guys to take what we just did through this instructor example, and I want you to add a little bit more functionality in here. Nothing crazy, but as of right now, my application, it requires me to refresh the page to put in this request. I want you guys to create a button that handles this, right? I don't want to keep refreshing my page. I want to be able to click a button that says generate dog photo, and every time I click it, I get a dog photo, right? Is there any questions so far on what we have to do?
Can you go back to your VS Code? Mine is not working. I'm getting an error, and I'm not sure why.
What's the error that you're getting?
I'm getting it says cannot set property of null setting SRC. So after my document.query selector, what I named it, source equals data message.
If it's no, that means the data that you're getting back from this API doesn't have anything in there. So you're trying to access some information and save it into your source, but there's nothing here, right? It's probably no. Go ahead and share your screen. Let's look at it. This is a good example to see how we can handle issues with the APIs. So share your screen real quick.
Sure.
Data. I want you to console.log that data. Open it up. So you're getting information, right? So that's working. But I see the issue here. How are you grabbing your tag? Look at the syntax, right? What is this? This is an ID, right?
Yep. Oh, I'm going by selector instead
You're
of query.
No,
by
so
ID.
you're on the right track. We're trying to grab a selector, right? We're querying for a selector.
Mhm.
But how does it know how to grab an ID or a class? Right?
Oh, I see.
There you go.
All right. Yeah, because the example you were using a class would be a dot dog img, and I'm
Correct.
using an ID, so it should be a pound sign. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Correct. Yeah, no problem. All right, time is 6:14. Let's go ahead and come back at 6:24 and give this an honest try. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and turn off our cameras. The moment that you guys are done, I want you to turn them back on. And that'll determine how much time we take. I'll see you guys in a bit. All right, so before a break, we went into a quick little assignment, and that was by adding a button here that when clicking it, it would generate a new photo. And as you can see here, I can refresh my page. When I first get to this page, there's no image here. I have my alternate tag here. It's not the most ideal. There's no CSS here, right? But it's just the functionality here that matters. But if I click generate dog photo here, it generates a random photo. The code was fairly simple. I use document.query selector, and I'm trying to grab what's known as photo generator, and that was a button here that I established. Very quick, simple button. I added a class called photo generator, and what I did was after I grabbed that button, I did an event listener, which was going to be the click method, and then I wanted this function to do something. So what I did was I just did a function inline using the fat arrow, and that function was going to do my fetch request. And within this fetch request, it was going to set the source of the image tag to the URL of that image. All right, pretty straightforward. I didn't have to do anything extra besides one line of code, which was by adding this here, and then just moving my fetch request within this add event listener method. So I'm assuming yours should be something very similar to this. But do I have any questions before we move on with today's lecture?
I have one quick one on my code. I did like a button also, and then I put a like on click command. I like Googled and it said on click. Is it preferred that type of stuff to be more so on the JavaScript side, or is it on the HTML file? Is that all right, or like preferred?
That's a hard question to answer because normally we would use on click or on submit. I would say it would be once again personal preference or how your company does it, how your team does it, but there's not a wrong or right answer. An on click method is what I usually tend to do. I just kept it to the same way that we've been doing it during the curriculum, but that's a good way of doing it too. So once again, multiple ways to skin the cat, both achieve the same result. There's other stuff besides on click. There's like on submit for like forms and stuff, which you'll see later. But I'm glad you were able to find something like that. That is a good way of doing it.
The event listener you use, doesn't that break the functionality of loading the page randomly when you refresh?
Yes, it does. Well, cool. I don't want it to show an image when I refresh. The point is, I want to take full control of generating this photo only when I press this button, right? Um, so yes, it won't automatically do it the moment I load in. I want it to do it when I press this button. Does that answer your question, Tim?
It does. So if you were going to do that for an actual page, more than just demonstration purposes, would you generate the image tag as well using JavaScript, using an inner HTML? Because otherwise, when you refresh, you have the little cannot find image in the upper left.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so if you want to make it dynamic where you don't have that, right? You definitely can do that. You can make this button just be here. There's an empty div there, and you can CSS it so it's all centralized, however you want it. And then the moment you press this button, it can make a new image tag with the new URL, right? And if you want to expand the assignment, you could do just as that, right? That every time you press this button, it can add more pictures of dogs here and keep them there in the div. So you can keep doing stuff like that. You can add more functionality, experiment. So it would depend on the purpose of your website and how you really want to structure it. If that's the how you want your website to work, then so be it, right? Does that answer your question, Tim?
It did. I have one more question.
Yes.
It keeps resizing the picture every time I generate a new image, and it's kind of annoying because some of them are fairly small and some of them are gigantic. How would you limit it from doing that? I tried using the CSS max height, max width, and it's just being ignored.
Your image tag needs to have. Did you add the max height and max width to that? You're muted.
Sorry, I added it to the CSS, not to the actual HTML inline.
You don't have to do it inline, right? But what are you manipulating with the CSS? Is it directly the image tag, or are you trying to manipulate something like the div? Because what's the max width of this image? What do you think is going to take the max width of and the max height?
The container.
And what is the container?
The container is a flex box.
Is it? Is that where you put it in?
Yes.
So make sure that if there's a max limit, then the max height and width is set to your container as well, right? So you can say like 500 view height, or 500 pixels in height, 500 pixels in width. And then when you set the height of your image and you put, for example, 100%, it's only going to take the size of your container. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So it's a little kind of, there's multiple steps to it, but you have to take into account, and what's the word I'm looking for?
Yeah, that was my issue.
The maybe the scope. No, not the scope. In what context are you trying to format your image? Right? Is it taking the full height of its container, or not? Right? And what's the container's height itself as well? Right? If your container is 500 pixels high and 500 pixels wide, but you tell your image is only going to be no more than 100 pixels, that's all it's going to take. But you say 100%, the percent, the context it's trying to format it is going to be in the context of the container that's with it. Make sense, Tim?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, guys, awesome. That was a good example. Hopefully, you guys are kind of understanding the API and how to talk to them. Let's go ahead and move forward. All right, so we display the random dog photo from the API. We added a button as well, so we added some more functionality. Now, what is happening every time I refresh the page, and we kind of already talked a little bit about this, we kind of went ahead, but essentially every time that you load this page, what it's going to do, it's going to once again load your HTML. It's going to get to the script tag where it's connecting the JavaScript. It's going to run the JavaScript, right? And because earlier we didn't have it in a function like this, right, where it's living within this function, earlier it was out in the open just like this. Oh my god, I went too far. It read the code from top to bottom, right? So the first line I got to was a fetch request. So there was no limit there. It wasn't waiting for me to run a function. The first line was the function being ran. So because of that, every time that I loaded up my browser, it would run my JavaScript from top to bottom and immediately put in this request. Or as when I had it like this, the function won't run on its own. This function will only run the moment that I click on this button, right? So that's kind of what was happening there. Query parameters, right? So we had a very simple URL earlier, and that was the fact that we took a very default URL that randomly selected an image, right? But there's a lot more that goes into requests, right? And this is going to be the next step, and it's going to be adding query parameters to the request you're trying to make, right? Here, the API we are using is going to be the Cocktail DB API. Let's go ahead and visit it real quick. And we can search for a cocktail here. Even gives us some popular drinks, popular ingredients. But let's go straight to the API documentation. And notice that this one has a lot more different endpoints than the dog API has, right? Because some APIs are a little bit more complex, have a lot more data, and it allows you to get different things. Now, how to access very specific data doesn't depend on the endpoints they created, because that's exactly what they did. When they created this API, they structured these API endpoints to point to a specific part of their database and grab information, right? So all these different endpoints here they created do different things. And we kind of see here, search cocktail by name. Well, the structure of the URL, very similar to most of them, is going to take the name of the API. It has the API parameter here to let you know that this URL is specifically for an API. It's in a JSON format. And the V1 is pretty standard on most APIs. You typically have that in your URL to let people know what version of the API they're utilizing, right? And that's because of scalability. When people create APIs, it's standard to add what version your API is in. Because as your API grows and you get more traffic through your application and you start making more changes and updating it, then you will create new endpoints with a different version. Because sometimes people won't update their site for a long time, right? And if you decide to update your API, but people are still using a different version, and you no longer support that version, then it's going to break everybody else's application that relies on your API. And then you're pretty much a useless service at that point. People are not going to want to use your stuff because you're a cruddy developer and you just broke everybody's applications. So when people have APIs, it's an actual service. Some of these are free, but there's other ones that will charge you, right? Typically, these APIs will have some kind of membership where they'll have like 50,000 API calls a month. But if you start exceeding your free API calls, then they'll start charging you per API. Sometimes it's very simple, like 1 cent per API call, right? Or like 10 cents for every 100 API calls. Every API is different, but there are services that charge for this. So that sometimes this is a whole business. You can actually do this and earn money out of it. But no one's going to want to use your API if you are no longer supporting older versions, and people are building a whole application out of this. So we have different versions of APIs, and it's pretty standard when you guys start building your own API, which you will for your own project. You're going to want to make sure you add the v1 for the version, and then we have the next parts of the URL, which is going to be the query parameters. Now, there are different ways of setting up your endpoints to query for different parts in your database or your API. Sometimes you can do it very similar to this, where you can add the query parameters in the URL path itself. And other times you can add it in the request body, which is not the URL path itself. But if you recall, the request body is what's being added to the request, right? So if we go to network, let's go ahead and refresh this. And there's a lot of API calls or a lot of calls being made here. But a request comes with a bunch of stuff like headers, right? There's ways to manipulate each of these headers when you make this request. Some are set by default, but you can add a header to add information to send it through a request, right? Not directly through the URL, but in the request itself. It's not something that you can visually see here in an interface, but the request body will have data that you can add things into it. But this API isn't structured that way. They take their query parameters in the URL path itself, and that's a method of doing it. And as you see here, we have different examples, whether we want to get a list of all cocktails by first letter, by name, search ingredient by name, and each endpoint has a different way of formatting their query parameters, right? And to know or figure out what the structure of these query parameters are, the only way to figure that out is to visit documentation of the API itself to see how they build their API. Everyone still with me here? All right. Well, here's the example for the cocktail database, right? They are putting an API request to this cocktail DB. They're searching for something, and it looks like they're looking for margarita. I can kind of assume what they're looking for. They're using this right here, this endpoint right here, searching a cocktail by name just by looking at the structure of the URL that they use. And they add the S to signify the, to be honest, I don't know what the S stands for, but I'm assuming they have some kind of meaning behind it. But after the S, you add the name of the margarita. If anyone can guess what the S is, I'm assuming maybe search. I don't know. But this specific endpoint is looking for a cocktail by name, right? Now, going back to our slides, I don't see any specific query parameters of a limit to how many drinks they get back. I'm going to assume that this is going to return all drinks that might contain the word margarita, because I see that's how many we get back. We get margarita, blue margarita, Tommy margarita, white cat margarita. Some APIs are a little bit more detailed than others. They'll tell you exactly what will be returned with the API call and how it works. Some can be a little bit more vague and won't be straightforward exactly with how they work. As you can see here, all this tells me that it's going to search a cocktail by name, but it doesn't tell me how many I'm going to get back. So I'm making an assumption here that's probably going to return to me all drinks that have the word margarita from the context clues that I can take from this response, right? But everything else is the same. It doesn't take any additional items within the request. All it's going to use is going to be the URL path, right? So let's see this in code. I'm going to go ahead and open up my VS Code here. Let's go to our cocktails. We're done with dog photo. Let's open up cocktails HTML and our app.js. And let me open with live server. All right. Now, let's see. This has the H1 element for which cocktail. We have an input tag with the type being text. Notice that name and value are empty. And then we have a button that has the get cocktail character strings in here. It's a type button, name button. And then we have an H2 that says name. We have an image tag that we don't see. Let's go ahead and say cocktail image so we can visualize where it's at. And we see here, this is where the image is supposed to be at, but the broken link, there's no source. And then we have an H3 where with instructions, but there's nothing afterwards. Well, let's look at our JavaScript. How is this actual request working and what is it doing? Well, it's putting in this fetch request, right? So it is going to put it in. I'm going to go ahead and assume it's going to work. We get the JSON back, and then we get the data. But what are we doing with the data? We're not adding it anywhere here. All we're doing is console.logging the data, very similar to how the dog was working. So I know that when I run this browser or this page, my bad, it is going to run my fetch request automatically because it'll run my JavaScript file. But if I want to see how this is working, I can see it using the console because we're printing it out. So let's go ahead and check that out. Let me open up the inspect tool, go to console, and I see that there is something here. The request did go through. We got an object with key value pair of drinks. The key is drinks, and I see the value is a list of other objects, right? This list has 6 different, and it tells me right here, 6. There's 6 different objects in here with different key pairs of ID, string drink. Let me open one up. And look, this is a lot of information just for one object. But I'm probably going to want something. I know that I have an image tag and it's empty because there's no source. So I'm probably going to want to get the URL for the specific drink. And I have a header that says instructions. So I probably want to grab the instructions from this drink. Let's see if it gives it back to me when I put in this request. I see here I have instructions. And I see string instructions, DE, ES, FR, IT, which I can assume is probably a different language. Maybe D, I don't know what DE stands for, but I know that ES probably, I don't know what ES, if I'm being honest with you. Spanish, Espanol, I don't know. But we have FR, which I can assume is French, IT for, I don't know. But I'm going to go ahead and assume that these are different languages. We're probably going to want to grab this key value pair here of string instructions and then use this for our instructions section, right? So they've kind of already gave you the structure here on this assignment. Your goal is going to be to do something with these, right? We have 2 different examples of the same code. One shows margarita, and it gives us 6 different drinks. And notice that the other slide, it has martini. Everything else is still the same, but this one's martini, and it gave us 9 drinks. So I think my guess is correct. It's going to grab all the drinks with the word martini in it. Notice it shows all martini, but also notice that the query parameter is in lowercase, but that doesn't specifically matter on the request. And this is going to be the practice for you guys. I want you guys to fix this and complete this assignment. You're going to use this API call that you guys are making to grab some information and fill in the blanks in your HTML file. Sound good? So what this should do is it should take in some input. Once you take in the input, you should be able to click this button. And when you click it, it should make this API call, grab the information, and it should populate the name, the image, and the instructions. Do I have any questions on this assignment? All right, I'm gonna give you guys 15 minutes. But we finished earlier, that's good too. Let's go ahead and turn off our cameras once again, and once you're done, turn them back on. I'll see you guys in a bit. Awesome. So before we went on break, or not break, when we broke up for the assignment, we were going to go over the cocktail assignment, right? So we were looking at the cocktail database here. And as of right now, when we load up our page on our console, we're getting a object from our fetch request, right? The assignment was to grab this object and to fill out the rest of our HTML and connect the button to work with our request here, right? So let's go ahead and get this rocking and rolling. So I know that I need to be able to receive input and then press this button, right? Now, how do I get this working? Well, I'm going to do a couple things here. As of right now, there's a couple ways of grabbing our tags here, and one of them is being the name, but the name can be a little bit conflicting. The way that we grab a tag by name is by using document.query selector, or my bad, not query selector. You can use get element by name. In this method, it's cool and all, but when you do this, you have to pass in the name that you're trying to get. For example, this will be button. This is going to return a list, right? So to access the items in here, you have to access it like a list, and it can be kind of annoying, right? Which is one of the reasons why we do query selector instead of doing stuff like get elements by name. And if we see here, when I refresh this, oh, what am I doing? I'm doing print. That's funny. Console.log. That's interesting. I didn't know you could do that. That's pretty cool. I've never used the print method in JavaScript. I didn't know you can print it out like that. That's awesome. I learned something new. When I refresh this, notice that when I'm console.logging the document.get elements by name, it returns to me a list, right? No list. And it's a list of every single element that it encountered with the name button, right? So now if I wanted to grab the specific button that I'm trying to reference, I would have to use like index or get an element by the index. And that's not very, I don't like how that is. So I'm going to ignore the name on this example. And let's just use IDs instead, or classes. So I'm going to say class. I'm going to say generate cocktail. And that's going to allow me to grab this button using the document.query selector and grab it using the class of generate cocktail. And when I grab it, I want to add an event listener, which is going to be click. And then this button should run my fetch method. All right, pretty straightforward. Let's see how it's working. I'm going to open the spec tool. Okay, it's already open. And when I press get cocktail, we see that it's going to fetch the drink. Instead of doing it with the refresh button, now we have a specific button here that's going to make this fetch request and get me what I'm asking for with the URL. Now, this isn't really interactive. It's going to give me the exact same drink, which seems to be margarita, because that's how I wrote my instructions to work. Right? As of right now, it is hard-coded to give me margarita every single time I put in this fetch request. Well, we want to be able to add input into this input box, take what's in here, and when we press get cocktail, the information that's in this input box, I want to be able to use that in my fetch request. So I need to be able to access this input box and then grab the information and add it within my fetch request. So first and foremost, let's go ahead and grab that input box. This has type, which is fine. Name, once again, I gave you the demonstration of how to use name, but I don't want to use this because as you saw, it's not, it's going to give me a list. I'm just going to go ahead and use class instead. And I'm going to say user input. And now when I press this button, what I want to do is grab the cocktail. So I'm going to say let cocktail equals document.query selector. I want to grab user input. This right here is going to grab that user input, but I don't want the tag itself. I want the value that's being saved in there. And to grab the value of an input tag, you have to call it the dot value method. It's going to return to you the items that is currently added within there, right? And before I start adding this to my fetch request, let's go ahead and console.log cocktail and see how this works. Right now, I'm still getting the martini or margarita because that's hard coded in there. But I am printing out the input that's saved within my input tag. Notice that it's blank. It's not giving me anything because there's nothing in here. But if I add martini, I'm able to grab the value that's in the input tag, and I'm still printing out the results for my fetch request, right? So now that I have the input, I want to ensure that I can format the fetch request to take this input and use this instead of margarita. Well, going back to basics, string interpolation, right? We want to kind of format this string because that's what the URL is right here. This is essentially just a string here in my JavaScript file. So I should be able to format this dynamically. And if you guys are familiar with string interpolation in JavaScript, which I'm hoping you guys should, it uses backticks to signify that, hey, this is going to use some string interpolation. There might be some values in here that you need to take into account and use the values in the variables as strings. And I want to format this part of my string. So instead of saying margarita, it's going to say the input that's being added into my input tag. So to do that, it needs to be added within curly braces, and there has to be a $sign right behind that. And notice it changes colors. Right now, it knows that this is going to be some kind of variable, right? So I want the value that's saved into this variable to be added into this string. And the variable I want is going to be cocktail, because that's where the string is currently at. So I'm going to add cocktail here, right? And now, let me go ahead and remove line 3, where I'm constantly logging it. Let's check it out. When I press get cocktail, notice that it says no data found because there was nothing in my input tag. So let's add martini. Press get cocktail. And now if I check my drinks, martini all the way across the board, right? So now my fetch request is dynamically receiving input from my user and taking that input to get a specific request that the user wanted. So now it's working to a certain extent, but I'm still not seeing anything in here. But the first part is done. I'm getting a very specific fetch request depending on whatever my user wanted, right? All right. So now that I have the information, I need to be able to parse through all this data, grab specifically the name, the image source, and the instructions for a drink, and show it to my user. Now, we have a large variety of martinis here, but I'm just going to go ahead and do the default, very simple, basic martini. I'm going to ignore everything else. That can be another feature later on, but I'm just going to grab one. So I need to be able to go through this data and find specifically for the name, martini. Well, this returns to me an object. So I know the first thing I have to go into is a key called drinks. and the result of drinks is going to be an array. All right, so the first one's going to have to be a key, and then I'm going to have to use an index to get the first item in this array. So I'm going to use index 0 to get this one right here. And this index is an object. So after I access index 0, I have to grab key of string drink to receive the value of martini. Is everyone with me still so far?
Yes.
Right on. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Before I start adding anything to any tags, let's kind of see if we can start printing it out using the console.log. So I'm going to say drink index 0, and let's see how this works. And now it's not working. What do you do, my friend? Reading 0. Okay, let's remove this index. And let's see how this is working. I think it's drinks. And I might have gone wrong there. Yeah, it's going to be drinks. Index 0. Okay, cocktail. And there we go. We're grabbing the very first item within all the strings. And now the next thing is going to get the key of string drink to grab martini. So string drink. Once again, martini. There we go. Now we're getting specifically the string. Okay, so I have the drink. Let's go ahead and do another console.log. This time, let's try to grab the image at index 0, which, let's see what's the key for this one. If we open it up, that's going to be string drink
thumb.
There we go. Awesome. Thank you, Tim. We're going to want string.
Sorry, I forgot
string.
I was not muted.
It's okay. There we go. Let's just verify. So we have the name and we have the image. And now we also want the instructions. So console.log data drinks index 0. And I want to say this string instructions. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tim. But yeah, there we go. We have the instructions. So now I have access to all 3 of the items that I need to finish off this assignment. Now I just have to be able to access these specific elements and format them to have the information I'm receiving. Well, let's see, how do we grab these? Well, the H2, I'm going to go ahead and add a class here, and I'm going to say drink name. This is going to be class of drink image. And the instructions is going to have a class of drink instructions. Now, so I don't have a bunch of mumbo jumbo here. I'm just going to go ahead and grab the drinks here. So let name is equal to document dot query selector drink name. And I'm going to say let image is equal to document dot query selector to drink image. And then let instructions is equal to document dot query selector to drink instructions. And finally, I can say name dot inner text is equal to, I don't know why this is commented out like this.
I had something similar, and with like the problem we did on Friday, and it said I like Googled it, and it said like it doesn't mean something's wrong. It just means there's like something in the settings that's like crossing it out for some reason.
Thank you for that reassurance. I appreciate it, Chase. Image, and then let's go ahead and say instruction is equal to, or instruction dot, maybe it's not going to be the best idea. We might want to create a paragraph after instructions. But let's get something first, and then we can manipulate the rest.
I used an ordered list, or unordered list rather, and it worked pretty well.
We definitely can. But let's go ahead and try it. Martini. And there we have the name takes the place. We have the image, and we have the instructions. So far, we complete the assignment. We added that some kind of dynamic functionality here. We can say margarita, get cocktail, and it goes to margarita. So it's working so far, guys, right? Now, maybe this isn't the best way of doing it because notice that margarita takes the place of the name and the instructions take the place of the word instructions. So the best way of doing this to be a little bit more dynamic would be to create a new element and append it to the specific tags. So let's do that real quickly. Let's do it for the name. And if we do it for the name, it should be the same thing for the instructions. But I want to create a new element and then append it to this H2. So I'm going to say drink drink name is equal to document.create element. And I'm going to create a p tag. And then I'm going to then give this p tag the inner text. And finally, I'm going to say name.append child. And I'm going to give it drink name. And let's see this working. And there we have it, to a certain extent. I was able to append the name to the H1 header. Let's see how that looks like on the elements. I didn't show it to me dynamically. There we go. I see it now when I hover over it. You can see in my inspector, you see the H2, which is drink name. It holds name, but then we have a p tag in there. Maybe it's not the best way of doing it, but this is a way of doing it. Do I have any questions on how that worked or what I just did? I know I went pretty quickly on that. You could add an unordered list in the pen that say, I think Tim was on the right ballpark there. Any questions? Comments?
If you wanted to do more than just, I'm sorry, Chase, go ahead.
Oh, I was
Or
about to
Jason.
I was about to say I'm probably just gonna rewatch this whole section. It's like I kind of get it, but I just need to watch it again.
What's the most confusing part? The code or what is actually happening here?
I'm just slow. I'll just say I'm just slow. It's like I feel like I could eventually figure it out, but it would just take me too long. I couldn't whip it out in like 15 minutes. But it's like
Okay.
I would eventually get there.
Okay. Thank you, Jason, for your feedback. Tim?
So I was able to finish exactly what you produced, and I was trying to work on how you would do it for more than just index zero, because that's what I did index zero to start with. So would you just nest that all of those basically into a for loop for each item in drinks in the array drinks? Like, and then
Yes.
it would just repeat everything down. It would work, but it would just be really long.
Yeah.
Could you
It,
also just could you dynamically create links that when clicked on would generate the content dynamically as well?
You could. We can try that. Is everyone on board to give that a try? If you guys want to see that, how we would handle multiple elements.
I'm sure if I played around with it, I could probably figure it out. But if we don't have time, don't worry about it.
Yeah. So what we can do is let's go ahead. I'm gonna go ahead and comment this out, but I'm going to grab this here, paste it here. Let's give this a try. I'm going to remove this console.log data. Let's just make sure it's working. Martini. I don't know why it's not keeping log to this. All right, so here we have a bunch of drinks. Well, if we wanted to grab every single one of them, we're gonna have to do some kind of for loop, right? So we would have to say something like, how could we do this? The first
Would
is
you be
gonna
able to?
be
Because I was like thinking about that also. I didn't get quite as far as probably you two did, but I was thinking about would you be able to use like the for each method to print out each ind or array thing?
yeah, we definitely can. Let's do it. Let's say so we're grabbing a JSON object here. So we can say I want to grab drinks, and that should give me the list, and I want to go through every single list. So it would look something like drink or data drinks dot for each, and I'm gonna say drink. See, how can we do this? Drink console.log drink. Let's see how this is working before I add more code in here. Martini. So there, I'm able to print out, I'm using the for each method to loop through this list, and I'm printing out every single one. Well, let's add more functionality here. Now that I have every single drink, I want to do something new. So I'm going to say, what can we do? We can do something like, once we get the drink, we're gonna want to create new H3s or H1s, right? Or H2s, my bad. We're gonna want to create a new header, a new image, and new instruction with the specific data. So we would say let drink name is equal to drink, and we want to grab string drink. Let me just make sure we're working here, right? Martini. Yeah, we want to grab string drink and add it to an H2 element. We're also going to want to grab the string image or string drink dumb, and we want to grab string drinks. I'm sorry, string instructions. So let's say drink title. Let's say let drink title is equal to document.create element is going to be an H2. And I'm going to say drink title dot inner text is equal to drink string drink. Or actually, we already assigned to a value drink name. Let's say let drink image is equal to drink string drink thumb. And then let drink instructions is equal to drink string instructions. We're going to create a drink img is equal to document.create element. Is going to be an image tag, and we want to create a drink p is equal to document.create element p. p tag. All right, so every time that we loop through a drink, we're gonna grab the name, the image, and the instructions. And at the same time, we're also gonna create a new h2, a new image, and a new p tag. Right? And every time we create one, we're going to format them. And I'm doing this very deliberately so we can see the different parts of what's happening here. We're gonna say drink title dot inner text is equal to drink name. Then I'm gonna say drink img is equal to drink image. Oh, I'm going to say drink image dot source. And then drink dot inner text is equal to drink p. Oh, my bad. I'm going to say drink p is equal to drink instructions. Am I confusing you guys, or are we still on the same page here?
No, no, that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I'm grabbing the information, I'm creating the element, and then I'm manipulating either the inner text for the header or the p tag, or for the image, I'm manipulating the source. Right? And now I have to append these to something. So I might say body dot append child, or I want to grab the body. I want to grab wherever I'm going to add this to. But I don't have the body right now. So let's say document. Let's say let page body is equal to document dot get element by tag name. And I'm going to say body. Then I'm going to say page body dot append child. And I'm going to append the drink title. And I'm doing a lot here. I don't even know what's going to work right now. I might have to do some formatting. But I'm going to give you an idea of how this will work, of how to dynamically do this. All right, and let's give it a try real quickly. Let's say martini. Okay, cocktail. And I figured it wouldn't be as simple as that. Append child is not a function. I'm getting an issue here. What if we do something like div class all drinks, and then I grab that specific div get or query selector, and I'm going to grab all drinks, and that's what I'm going to append it to. Let's try it again. Martini, get cocktail, and something didn't work. This right here did not work, but we'll handle it in a bit. But as you can see, we're able to dynamically grab every single drink that it gave us and create new elements with everything. The only thing that we don't get here is instructions, so we can handle that in a bit. There's something wrong with instructions. I don't think we grabbed the instructions correctly. String instructions. Oh, I added the wrong one here. My bad. Drink P. No, drink INS. There we go. I was about to have some kind of error. That was a lot of code that I wrote. There we go. Now we got it working. I see some stars in y'all's eyes, but we're able to dynamically grab every single drink within this request and create new elements with their corresponding text. Pretty cool, huh?
Could you go back to your for each loop?
Yeah. Let me remove these console logs.
Oh, that's why. Okay.
Create or grab the data from the request. Create new elements. manipulate new elements with request data, add new elements to our HTML if. Right, and I did it very deliberately here so we can see every single part of this. But essentially, there's a couple steps I had to take. One, I had to isolate the individual code for every drink that I grabbed, right? Because that's what this is doing. This is a for loop in this sense. It's looping through this JSON object we had that we know this right here is going to return a list of different objects of drinks. So I want to grab every single one of those within this list. As I grab every single one of them, I'm going to grab the information within this JSON. I'm going to create new elements where I'm going to add this data into. And once those elements are created, I add the data. And then I actually have to manipulate my DOM to append these new elements that were created. Kenny asks, does append child just mean create child? Negative. The child was already created, but it didn't belong to anybody, right? So when we say child, we're talking about the hierarchy of the elements here, right? If you start nesting something, a good example would be like creating a unordered list, right? So if I did UL, right, to add a list item into the UL, I have to nest the list item within the unordered list, right? In essence, these list items are children of the unordered list, right? So when you nest something within under the tag, the relationship that these tags have is a parent and child relationship. So when you say append the child, you're directly adding something nested within a different element, right? Directly underneath it, right? So what this ended up doing is in this div tag that we have here, it created a bunch of divs and appended it to this specific div right here, right? This div called all drinks is now has multiple different divs appended to it, right? So we didn't create the child by using append child. All we did was give it a child, almost like think of it as adopting, right? The child wasn't specifically belonging to this div, but we forced it on him and told him, hey, this is now your new child, right? I'm giving it to you. Congratulations, you're a father, right? That's kind of what append child is doing. You're just appending something to somebody else. You're passing on that role to somebody, and you're giving it directly to this div, right? So append doesn't create, it adds it to it, right? Very similar to how when you have a list and you add a new list item, you append a new list item in Python. That's what you're doing. You're adding to it, or you're pushing in a sense. If you're talking in regards of JavaScript, you're pushing something, right? I believe that's the syntax for it. I sometimes get it mixed up, but you're adding something to it. You didn't create that item when you appended it. It was already created. You're just adding it into it. Make sense, Kenny? Right on. Okay. Well, this is going to conclude the Cocktail DB. Time is 7:50. Let's go ahead and take our last 10-minute break of the night, and then we're going to continue with today's lesson. I hope this is very informative. You guys are learning a lot from this. I'll see you guys at 8. All right, welcome back, guys. We just came back from our 10-minute break. We finished the cocktail. The next slide is more practice for you guys if you want to try it out. And this practice will be to make your app work with the drink Moscow Mule. Now, why is this one unique? And that's because there's a space, right? These are two different words, where the other ones that we use, like martini and margarita, were individual words. There's specific syntax when you add multiple words in your query parameters. It's usually an ampersand sign. You can test it out, do a quick Google search, or you can look through here if you want to see how it works. Like here, you can see cocktail underscore glass. So it looks like for this one, it takes an underscore. Very simple one if you want to go and add some more functionality to your code. So there's your other example. But if you want to expand on this assignment, you definitely can. Let me go ahead and I'm sorry for Steam. I always forget to exit out. Let me exit out real quick. We should be good now. But let's go ahead and continue with today's lecture with APIs. And the next part is going to be an introduction to Postman. And Postman is going to be your best friend when working with APIs during the development process of your personal project, right? Let me go ahead and open up Postman. And hopefully I'm already signed in. You can download it now, or you can wait till your cohort. It doesn't really matter, but you're gonna want to have Postman installed at one point, right? And Postman is an open source application that you guys can download to make pinging APIs very simple. So in the event you don't want to open up some kind of JavaScript file and code out a fetch request, and you want to test out that you are pinging the API, and I mentioned that's going to come in handy when you're creating your personal project, because you're going to have to create your own backend, right? And the backend part is your database, right? Working on your database for your own application. Essentially, you're going to be creating API endpoints, an API for your own application, where you're going to store stuff like user information, logins. For example, my job tracker app has its own backend that I constantly ping. That's where I have all the information for my users. It tracks all their job applications they save on their profile. That's all being saved to my backend, right? And the backend is my database. Essentially, it's an API, right? And the way that my front end, right, is talking to my backend is the same way that we just saw right now, using some kind of fetch request, right? And this can simulate that process without adding some code. And it looks something very similar to this. When you open up a new page, you can specify what type of request you want to make. And these are a little out of scope right now because we have yet to talk about CRUD. But the type of request we've been making, although you don't realize it, is a GET request, right? We're getting information from a API, from a database somewhere. And then here's the URL or the endpoint that we want to point towards to. And to show you how this works, we're going to go ahead and we're going to grab this demo for this Cocktail API. And it's as simple as adding the URL point and pressing send. And the same thing that you saw in your console on the browser, it'll simulate it here without adding any code and building out some kind of GET request in JavaScript. And at the very bottom, you'll get the response that it's supposed to give you if the endpoint worked, right? So if you want to test out if the endpoint is actually active, if the API is working, if your backend is working, you would use Postman, so you don't have to go through the extra steps of creating the request in code yet while you're in the process of developing your endpoints, right? Because in the cohorts, they're going to show you how to create these endpoints yourself to be very specific to your application, right? So my application is something like www.cyberhire.com/API/v1. And then like for the login, it'd be /login, right? I had to create manually that endpoint myself, and I was testing it out with Postman. There's some additional stuff that you can add here if you want to format the request. We mentioned that requests have different things. It's not just the URL. It has things like authorization, headers, right? If my request is supposed to take a token, I can come here and I can add a header for authorization, add a token. This is from one of my applications I was working on earlier with the immersive program. You can see you can add things to the body to grab very specific things, right? When you put in a request in API, you can say like you can pass in an ID or the name, right? If I was looking, for example, for a specific user, I'm trying to log in a user, this request that my front end is going to be grabbing is going to grab the information from the user, the email and the password. It's going to add it to the body and send that in the request. So my backend will receive the body and it uses that to make the request. So there's more to API requests than just the URL. And Postman allows you to add these different things in here, right? Notice that this endpoint, it kind of already pre-formatted for me. The S, right? It's formatting this part right here. the S is one of the key parameters, and the value is the item I'm looking for, which is margarita. And I can kind of update this to say martini, and notice that it formats my URL, and I can look for martini, and it gives me the martini one. All right, so Postman is a very helpful tool when pinging other APIs, not just yours, but third-party APIs. So download it now if you want to. You're gonna be instructed to download it as well once you get into the immersive program or the evening, weekend, or DevOps, because you're gonna have to test your backend in this manner. All right, so it's good to already have it and mess around with. Is there any questions in regards to Postman?
So a little more involved than just logging into the website. Yeah, it's actually something you download, because I was able to log in with my Google account.
Yes, you have to download the application into your computer. It's like, yeah, it's an actual program you have to download. I believe you can use it on the browser. I'm not quite sure, but just have it on your desktop. It's going to be very useful. You're going to use this very frequently when working with your backend, so you're going to need it anyways. But just be aware that this is one of the tools that we use, and it's very helpful for talking with APIs. It saves you time from coding the actual request. Make sense? Awesome. All right. We talked about testing API. I use a cocktail one instead of the Pokemon. That's okay. All right, the newish API syntax. All right, we've been talking about the old one so far. This is going to be the new way of actually pinging APIs in the way that you're going to be expected to do it in the actual program. Now, it doesn't change too much, but there is different syntax to this, right? Instead of using fetch, you're going to use an async function, right? An async function. So you're going to start off by making the function, and you're going to name it async. Once again, why do you think, and probably Tim can answer this, why do you think we're using async? What is the async doing?
Asynchronously being executed, so it doesn't have to wait for other stuff.
Yeah, right. It's gonna wait for the request to finish so you can have access to it. Because if you notice that lag before, right? It was trying to display something before it got the information. So async lets our function know, hey, like before you move forward, you have to wait for this request, right? So the async is mandatory in here. We're going to declare a function. You can name it what you want to name it, but they named it get fetch here to kind of give you a semantical meaning of what this is doing, which is essentially making a fetch request for an API. And the way that it works is you want to create the URL like this. Unlike before where you use the fetch method and you pass in the URL into the method, we are essentially creating our own function, right? The fetch method was a pre-made function that comes with JavaScript. Here we're going to create our own method. And so in essence, we're essentially just recreating the fetch method ourselves. All right, so we create the URL. You notice here, and we'll talk about this right now in a bit. But we are creating the URL, and you can format the URL here however you want to do it. Notice they're using the Poke API, and they're appending something to the end of the URL, right? Well, what is this choice? Well, here above it, we see that choice is they're grabbing the query selector of input, right? So they're grabbing an input tag, and they're taking the value, right? If you were using the cocktail as an example, they will be getting that input bar to receive the input that the user is requesting from them. They're grabbing that value and saving it to the choice variable, and they're appending that variable to the end of the URL, so they can essentially do the same thing that I did with string interpolation, but they're doing string concatenation here, where they're just combining them together. Make sense? Once the URL is created, they create a variable called data, and notice that they use the fetch method again, but they put the await method, right? They put the await method. So it's telling this like, hey, instead of using .then, we're using await, right? So the await and the .then are pretty much the exact same thing, just the syntax is a little bit different. So the data is going to have the information that's going to return from this fetch method, and the await is telling their code like, hey, do not continue forward until this fetch request comes back, right? And I want you to save the information into this variable called data. And once the information is retrieved, once again, we have to convert it into JSON. And instead of using the .den method like you saw with .den, and then use the data for res.json, they use the await, right? So very similar concepts, just different syntax, right? They await the conversion of data into JSON, and they save that into this variable called Pokemon info, and this is now the converted data, and we can console.log that Pokemon info, right? Now let's check it out. This is going to be the last example for today. It's going to be the Pokemon API. And you're going to get sick of this because you're going to use it a lot in the cohort. But it's pretty cool the first time you see it. So Pokemon API, let's go ahead and open up the HTML. And I'm going to open up the JS file. And let's run this with live server. Right, very similar to how the cocktail one is. It's kind of structured already for you. Let's go ahead and format this. Right, we have the H1 that says which Pokemon. We have the input tag. Notice the value is set to 0. There's no class, nothing, so on and so forth. We then have a button very similar to the cocktail one. And this button says get Pokemon. It doesn't have anything attached to it. There's no class, no ID, no function. We then have a H2 element that says name question mark. We have an image tag, and the source is a Pokemon.jpg. Where is this picture coming from? Well, it's saved within the Pokemon directory, right? It's a downloaded file. This is not a URL specifically, it's a file path, which is why we're displaying this. This is just kind of like a placeholder for now. There's no alt attribute that's blank. And then after the image tag, we have type question mark, and there's nothing that follows. Now, what is this actually doing? Let's look at the JavaScript. Well, the JavaScript, it's connecting the button, right? So it's grabbing the button, and it has an event listener on this button. And that event listener is the click. And then on click, we're going to run the get fetch method. Well, what is this doing? It's going to take the input from this input tag. It's going to concatenate it with the URL. It's going to make the request, convert it into JSON, and then it's going to show us the info. Well, let's look at the info. Inspect tool. If we say ditto, we see here that we get the JSON for ditto. It's a huge piece of information, but it's all nested. And it's not complete. It's not doing anything. The default picture is still here. There's nothing on name. There's nothing on type. It's pretty similar to the cocktail in regards to what we have to do. We need to be able to receive the information and then format the tags to have their respective info of name, the image, and the type. Right? The name, the image, and the type. Right, so you have to write the code for this app so that on the button click, the H2 element changes to the Pokemon search. The default image is replaced with a picture of that same Pokemon, and the type of Pokemon is listed in the H3 type element. If you have time, add a checkbox next to the Get Pokemon button that says Shiny, right? For those of you not familiar with Pokemon, which I'm pretty sure we all are, is you have, those rare Pokemons called the shiny Pokemon. Okay, I see no one, Tim. So we have Pokemon, right, which is kind of like a monster. Or are you joking, Tim?
I understand what Pokemon are. I have no idea what a shine or
A shiny is almost like a mutation, right? It's a rare version of the original Pokemon, but it's almost like an albino, right? So if you ever see an albino in nature, that's a very rare, right? So it's a rare version of a Pokemon, and it's called a shiny. It's just another word for like albino, but it's not necessarily albino. It could be any specific color. The different Pokemon have their own shiny version, right? So when you look at this request, right, and you go to the images, which is going to be under sprites. Let's see if we can find the shiny. Here we go. We have back default, back female. We have back shiny female. Front default, front female, front shiny female. So there is a regular front side and back side, but there's also a front shiny version and a back shiny version. So you can get either the shiny version of the Pokemon or the regular version. So that's gonna be like kind of like the extra stretch if you want to do more on this assignment. Get this working with the regular expectation, and if you have time, then add that checkbox where if you click it, instead of giving you the default version, it's going to display the shiny image of the Pokemon. Make sense? Now, another thing you might encounter is that some Pokemon have multiple types, right? And by types is, we have fire, we have water, we have ghost type, we have grass type, electricity or electric type. But some Pokemons have multiple types. Some might be fire and flying, right? Or rock and grass. I don't know all the combinations, but you're gonna have to either figure out how to put all of them here, or at least put one. I recommend you put all the types that it has, and this really is gonna test you on kind of going through the data and trying to figure out what data you want to grab from the JSON and use on your program. Do I have any questions before we break up into teams or individual work to do this? All right, let's give it a try. We're gonna come back at 8:50, and then we're gonna take a volunteer and then give it a go. Once again, I want you guys to turn off your cameras, and if you are done, turn them back on. And I will see you guys at 8:50 or sooner if everyone finishes. All right, let's go ahead and come back. I see Chase, your camera's on, so I'm assuming you were able to complete the assignment. Would you like to be the volunteer for tonight?
Yeah, I can do that. So oh, okay. Share my screen. Okay, are you able to see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So here's this. I'll just put in I'll put in one of my favorites. So Charizard, get Pokemon. Obviously it updates that photo, has that, the two types. And then if you click shiny, it then updates it. And I'll have that. And I think the reason the second type, the flying type disappeared, I just realized that. So if we look at my code, let's see if I can move this. So if we look at my code, I kind of left all this the same, but I created the checkbox. So I did put the input of a checkbox, named it as class checkbox, and I put a label for it for shiny. And then that's pretty much really the only thing I changed over here. But over on the actual apps JavaScript file, so it goes to the document, does the button, once I click get Pokemon, goes to get fetch. And then I basically said, I had to Google a little bit, but it said if the checkbox is checked, it's going to run this, the rest of this function. So if it's shiny, right, it's going to run this. So this is all that was in there. Console log, just like could obviously get all that info. Then I did the shiny. I went into the Pokemon info. I went to the sprites folder and then pulled the front shiny part of the array. And then just I had that, so it cleaned this up a little bit. Same with Pokemon name, I did that. Pokemon type, I also did that. There's obviously two types, so that's where here. When I changed it to shiny, it only showed the first type of fire for Charizard. So I think if I went like this and copy the rest of that, it would be down here. No. Okay. That should change it. Just to make sure that works. I go say Pikachu. Oh, I bricked it.
It happens.
Okay, so where is this at? This is at creating variables. Pokemon type. Okay, I will work on that, but that's how I did it basically. And then if it's not a shiny, so if the checkbox is not checked up here, it'll just skip this all, go straight to this one, which is pretty much this one. But it just uses the front default photo. So that's where if you get all that, like you could do Raichu to change it. Oh wait, okay, for some reason it's not working, but that's because I didn't save it, I think. Okay, but it worked for a second. I think I messed something up.
Refresh your
So I
page
can,
just in case. Maybe it's just live server being, live server. Okay. Yeah, that's
might be
weird.
something.
I mean, we saw the
Um,
initial demonstration, so I see that you made significant progress. So even if you have a little bug here or two, that's okay. That's
okay.
that's still great work. Which is pretty awesome. I'm assuming most of you guys are somewhere around here, if not like close. Is that correct, or is there anybody here that specifically just very struggled with this assignment?
I struggled, but that's because apparently I can't read. And within the abilities um, array, or within the abilities object, the key ability has another subkey called, or abilities has a subkey called ability, and I didn't see that until just now, and I just want to.
Yeah, it happens. Yeah, that's fair. Okay. Jason, you feeling good?
Yeah, I felt like I spent most of the time just trying to get the correct like object for most of them. But I need to go back through. But I felt like things were just moving too fast going through the cocktails. So I kind of feel like I
Okay.
need to go back through that video. I need to go back through that. And then I don't feel like the Pokemon is that much more advanced. It's just kind of like a few different things. So
Yeah, it's
I'm not sure how much time I'm gonna have tomorrow because tomorrow I'm gonna be at the VA all day, which sucks.
that's
So I won't
okay.
get to put the time in that I wish I could.
I feel your pain. I'll be there too.
Yeah, that's fine. Tomorrow we might have a very slow class. It might just me, Chase, and Kenny, and
Yeah,
that's okay.
I mean, I'll be able to go to the class, but I'm frustrated that I'm not gonna have the time in between
Okay.
tonight and to work on things. But I should still be able to show up tomorrow evening.
Oh, perfect. That's great then. Yeah. Well, hopefully today helped. And I explained it as best as possible. To finish off today's class, we're just gonna go ahead and do a quick talk through of exactly everything that we did to ensure we really understand the process of what's happening here. Uh, to ensure there's no confusion because you guys might be fine, but there's other people also that are watching this, and that's reflected by the views on YouTube. Just so I ensure that I taught this to the best of my abilities for everybody. Um, I want to show a quick demo. Maybe this helps, maybe it doesn't. But I want to break down the process of how this is working, right? And that is by talking about like the cycle of it all, right? We have two things here talking. One is our application, right? This is your HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and then we have our API that we're trying to ping, right? Um, in here, we have a JavaScript file. Uh, in this JavaScript file, it has some kind of, and I'm gonna say the word get because that's really what we're doing here, and it'll make more sense tomorrow. I know we've been using the word like fetch and stuff, but this is in essence it's a get request, and this get request has some kind of URL, right? And it uses that URL to know what to talk to, right? It's gonna use that URL and then send a request, right? Essentially it's like calling and talking to the API via phone call in a short way, right? And this request, it looks very similar to it, where it was like fetch, and then we had like Pokemon / API v1 Charizard, right? This is our fetch. It's going to go to the API, and then the API is going to receive the request. All right, this is the Poke API, and when it receives the request, what it's going to do is going to speak to its database or its backend using this request that we sent it, and is going to query the database. And query is just a fancy word for like look up or like filter through or kind of just search through, right? It's going to search through or query its database for the information that we asked for in our request. And then it's going to either give us a green light. It's going to give us either a green light or a red light, right? Now, in the event that it's good to go, it's going to return the information back to us. It's going to send it back to the API. The API is going to send back a response, right? It sends back a response. So it takes requests and sends out response. And this response is a JSON object, right? It's a JSON object. And this JSON object came with multiple things. We had like, and I'm just making stuff up here in the fly, like Pokemon is Charizard. We had like sprites, right? And this is like URLs. It had abilities. And this is another JSON object in here with like ability. It was fire, right? Ability is wing attack, and just stuff like that, right? So it takes a request in the form of some kind of a URL, and then it's going to return to us a JSON response. And before we actually use it, what's going to happen is it's going to have some form of a filter, right? It has like a filter that we have to make it go through, and this filter is our response.json that we have to kind of get the response, convert it into JSON format, because this maybe it's a little bit misleading, but it's not exactly in JSON yet. It's in the raw response, which isn't JSON specifically. It's just a bunch of packets of data using a certain protocol to get to us. But when it gets here, we convert it to JSON, and once we get it in JSON, then that's when we actually utilize it, and we then display it in our application, right? In our browser. We use that to do some formatting, create some elements, and kind of show the information we use in the form of tags that would be displayed onto our browser, right? Does everyone understand how this process works and how we're talking to these APIs? What a request is, right? It's essentially in order, right? Think of it in order. This goes back to the analogy that we use with the restaurant, right? We put in an order. The menu was kind of the interface for the API, right? We read through the menu or the documentation to figure out how we order this item. We want to order Charizard, so we put in this request. That's my order ticket. It gets sent to the kitchen, right? The API. It goes into the kitchen, which will be the database. It gets my order, and then it plates it and sends it back to me. In this essence, this is the server bringing me my order in the form of a response, and then I convert it in a way that makes it easy for me to digest, so I can use it, right? Everyone good so far? Do I have any questions on APIs, how to interact with them, or the process in general?
I was gonna say, so all the Pokemons have the same the JSON responses are organized in the same way. So it's like if you could reference one, you could reference all of them with the same, I guess, object keys and all that.
Yeah, and that's determined by the person that created this API, right? And you'll go through the same thing once you guys go through your cohorts. You're gonna have to format your response in what we call a view, and this will make more sense once you get into the program or once you start the program. But you will format how this response gets sent back to the front end, right? And so the person who created this or the people who created this, they have it, this some form of format, and this is how we're getting it, right? So for the most part, things tend to stay the same. Where things might change, might be if there's some Pokemons that might be more newer who might have like null values that might not have any actual data in these keys, right? So you might have to take into account to that if you're actually going on with a full-on project. But yes, for the most part, it stays the same because that's how it was structured. Make sense, Jason?
Sorry, I'm trying to click my button. Yeah, yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, awesome. Well, we're going to stop here. Time is 9:01. We're 1 minute over, but hopefully today was very informative. Tomorrow, we're going to continue with the API. We're going to talk about using local storage, and then we're going to do the bot score, and finally the NASA API. This will probably take us about halfway through to the class, and then afterwards we're going to start CRUD apps, right? And CRUD, which we'll learn more about tomorrow, is doing more than just GET requests, like doing like reading, updating, and deleting stuff. And what we're gonna do for this specific lesson is gonna be creating a to-do list, right? So you'll be able to create a whole program that can, save tasks, delete tasks, update tasks, and so on and so forth. And we'll elaborate more on that. But part of tomorrow will be the remainder of the API, and then the start of the CRUD app. And then on Wednesday, we should start Python, depending how well tomorrow goes. Do you have any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have any time after this that I could go through
Yeah,
something specifically?
I got a little bit. I'll go on a restroom break, but yes, I do.
Awesome. I'll wait.
Okay. Well, if I got no further questions, I will see you guys tomorrow. Y'all have a good night.
Thank you.